This is the deer, an extinct entity from Doors which I am bringing back to life, and maybe even back to the game. Alright, so although the Outdoors update was implemented nearly 4 whole months ago, one big mystery still remains in the subfloor, and that is, where do the deer skulls originate from? On top of fireplaces in cabins in the Outdoors, you can find mysterious deer skulls with glowing white eyes, a plaque signifying that this skull belongs to some creature that has been hunted. Given how we never see this deer creature in game, I'm led to believe it's gone extinct. However, I have reconstructed what I believe the entity looked like in its original state, before being turned into the plaque we see in the Outdoors cabins. Today, I want to go over this entity, why it looks the way it does, and if it, or something like it, has any chance of actually being implemented into the game. We have got a lot to discuss today, so with all of that being said, let's begin. Alright, so as I said, the main piece of evidence we know a deer-like entity existed at some point in the Outdoors is because their skull can be found on top of fireplaces and cabins. What's more, we actually know what their official name is. Periodically, certain paintings in the Outdoors will depict the deer skull, and upon interacting with them, it is revealed that they are called deers, with a literal question mark at the end of their name. That is their literal name, with the question mark. Now, one of the main rules about Doors entities is how they can't just be real animals. For example, Timothy, although seeming like a normal spider, canonically is incredibly intelligent, and that's why he is an entity and not a real animal. Additionally, gloom bats are an animal hybrid, being a mix of bats and moths, a trait that also makes them entities and not real animals. The deers in Doors aren't real creatures from Earth. They need to have some sort of defining characteristic that makes them unique, and I believe that trait is that they are Wendigos. Wendigos are often depicted as human-like deers with exposed bones, and most notably a deer skull for a head. A user named Gabius created a depiction of what they believe the deers originally looked like prior to their extinction, and I expanded on their concept by translating it into a very bare-bones model in the game. I'd imagine the deers in Doors would naturally have skeletal heads, just like traditional Wendigos. However, their neck bone and ribcage would also be exposed, similar to how Figure looks. I did reuse the horse model for this showcase, so you may notice the body looks a little more horse-like in this concept, but I think it still works. Most notably, the deer's tail is a lot more horse-like, but that can just serve to differentiate the entity from its real-world counterpart. Anyways, I also imagine the deer would be hostile, as most Doors entities are. To further this archetype, I made the deer have long claws rather than hooves which it can use to slash and attack its victims, which does play a role into its proposed functionality, but I'll get into that a little later. So, now that we have gone over what the deer's rough appearance could have been, how would they have functioned? Well, let's start with movement. Traditionally, Wendigos are often thought of moving on their hind legs, similar to how humans walk. However, seeing how these entities' heads are used as hunting trophies, I'd also imagine they'd move a little more animalistically, that being on all fours. I believe that the deers would incorporate both movement styles into their behavior. What I imagine is that normally they would walk on all 4 of their limbs like a typical animal. However, once they spot their victim or become aggravated, they'd run towards them in their hind legs, much like a traditional Wendigo. I also think this movement method would enhance the scare factor of this entity. After all, Doors is a horror game, as it could definitely shock players to see this almost normal-looking animal suddenly start booking it towards them on 2 hind legs rather than on all 4s. Unfortunately, I wasn't actually able to model the entity on its hind legs, so just imagine it for now. As for functionality, I think the deer could be a great way to implement items being directly used to combat entities. This is already in-game in the form of Sally, who, as you may know, can only be countered by giving her an item. However, it's a lot more tricky in her case, as items are a lot rarer in the hotel and she is programmed to only spawn if players have at least 1 item on them. The deer would spawn in the Outdoors, however, and this subfloor just so happens to spawn one of the most incredibly common items in the entire game, and that is the lantern. This thing can be found literally everywhere, from on tables to inside of cabins. It's straight up impossible to never witness this thing in an Outdoors playthrough. And seeing how item disabling modifiers don't work in the Outdoors, all players have the opportunity to grab and use a lantern. What this means is that the lantern and its light-emitting property could be implemented into the deer's functionality. The only question that remains is how? Here is my idea. Every so often, you can come across a deer roaming a room in the outdoors. They will start off walking on all four limbs. However, if they look directly at you, they will notice you and run towards you on their hind legs. If they catch you, they'll use their claws to kill you. Hiding will not work, as if you attempt to hide from the deer, it'll just open the closet doors, grab you, and kill you that way. In order to actually counter the deer, you need to repeatedly flicker a lantern in front of it, which would cause the entity to scurry away. Given how common lanterns are in the outdoors, there should be no issue for players to actually obtain one. And seeing as how you need to flicker your lantern to ward it away, instead of just turning it on once, a learning curve is implemented so players can use trial and error to figure out how the entity actually is countered, which is kind of the main point of doors as a whole. It even adds a little more functionality to the lantern, which is pretty useless in the outdoors on its own, as no dark rooms are actually present here. So, with all of that out of the way, now it's time I address the final question. Will the deer actually be added to doors? Well, the concept I created is just fan-made, so although that likely won't be implemented, the entity itself was created by the developers. So it could be added in some way, shape, or form. Given the announcement of more frequent mini-updates called batches, it's possible one could be added to the outdoors that makes these deer entities actually encounterable. However, as of now, we have no confirmation if this will ever be added. Still, I think the concept of a Wendigo entity is super unique, and I feel this is a perfect way to implement that, especially since the deer skulls in the cabins in the outdoors look like they belong to Wendigos. It just fits so perfectly. So, to summarize, in the outdoors, you can occasionally come across a deer skull on top of a fireplace in a cabin. These skulls belong to some entity that no longer exists, meaning they likely went extinct. With the help of Gabius, though, I created a model to showcase what I believe the deers look like when they were still alive, with some horse-like characteristics since I just reused other models in the game, and I took inspiration from the appearance of traditional Wendigos. I'd imagine these deer entities would roam the outdoors on all four limbs, yet run towards players on their hind legs when attacking. In order to combat a deer, you must grab one of the incredibly common lantern items and flicker it around them, which will spook the entity and cause it to run away. The deer entity currently has no confirmed plans of being implemented, yet it is possible, especially with the announcement of more frequent mini-updates. So, with all of that being said, let me know in the comments what you think of this new deer entity, as well as what other functionalities you think it should have, as although I'm pretty sure I like the flickering light thing, there's always more stuff that could be added onto it. And thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.